Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a special guest, Derrick Van Every. He is a PhD candidate at McMaster University. And yeah, man, looking forwad to chatting with you. Done a ton of cool research here and obviously had a new review paper come out recently, which we talked about off air, led to a lot of controversy. You wouldn't think it would, but it led to some controversy online. And he's a fellow hockey fan as well, too. So we got to chat a little bit about that. But yeah, Derrick, thanks for hopping on, man, and taking time out of your day to chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeff. I'm really looking forward to having our conversation today. So thank you.
Yeah, man. So I guess to start off, I guess what kind of led you to pursuing your PhD? I know you said you at one point opened up a gym and everything like that. So just curious to how you got to where you're at today.
Yeah, thanks. So I've been weight training since I was in grade nine. So I've always just taken to it. You mentioned me being a hockey fan, and that's initially what led me there was to pursue higher levels of hockey. Being Canadian, it goes hand in hand. Wasn't the most gifted skater, but I tried to be strong on my feet and use strength training as an avenue for that. And just fell in love with it, man. Honestly, I ended up playing a few years of junior C hockey here in Canada, and in my last year, I started getting into like front squatting and stuff to really strengthen my quads. Was the kind of impetus for that. And I had a guy come up to me and was like, "Oh my god, man! I thought you were gonna back squat that. You front squatted it." And I was like, "What is happening, dude? You gotta look into powerlifting. Like you would win." And I was like, "What is powerlifting?" Yeah, a year and a half later, I certainly fell down that rabbit hole. Yeah, got into powerlifting, competed at some pretty fun national level meets. Like I said, circling back in 2017, so I went to university to pursue a degree in kinesiology. And for me, it was originally, honestly, to be like a gym teacher, just because my grandfather was a principal and my mom was a nurse, and she always was like, "Be a teacher; it's the best job ever." And I got into it. So in 2017, like 2 weeks before I finished or was scheduled to graduate from my undergrad in kinesiology, my father unexpectedly passed away from a heart attack. And like he wasn't like a overweight guy or anything, but he was quite sedentary. So he was a truck driver, and so, yeah, a lot of time sitting driving. Anyways, while I was finishing a prep for junior nationals here in Ontario, our gym closed down and we didn't have a gym. And so between that and the death of my father, like my wife and I and girlfriend at the time were talking, we're like, why don't we just try it in our town? We don't have anything. The people of the community, like, so it was twofold. Like one, selfish endeavors to give myself a place to train, because powerlifting is not always accessible in small community gyms, etc. And then obviously just trying to expand and give the people in my hometown somewhere to exercise and strength train. Yeah, as I was in teachers college, my final year, Brad Schoenfeld had posted that he was starting a master's program and taking students on. And I was honestly like reading his work for fun. And I remember like in class when I was in teachers college, we were like having a presentation and I was like reading one of his papers before I was about to go up and present. And I'm like, the hell am I doing here, man? I don't like I love doing this. This is way more fun. And so I applied, and yeah, the rest is history. Did a 2 years master's in Lehman at Lehman College in the Bronx with Brad. He was a fantastic mentor, supervisor, and then super grateful for the opportunity to join Steve Phillips in the protein metabolism lab at McMaster back home, only 2 hours from my hometown in Hamilton. Yeah, super thankful for the journey where I am today. And yeah, just like I said, I love doing the research and being able to draw that line between the application in the gym from the sterile lab environment. And so having a hat in two places is a lot of fun for me.
No, that's awesome, man. Again, like you said off air, a lot of researchers aren't always applying it practically as well. And it's like you also live it, which, again, that gives you a nice blend of experience as well too, that right. And you're working with clients, but you also train yourself as well too. So you said you're 2 hours away from the lab. Do you have to drive in or like what or do you or what is that kind of?
Yeah. So, yeah, I should have clarified. So my hometown, we live in a small town in Ontario, Canada. It's 2 hours from McMaster, but my wife and I, and we have a daughter and son as well, James and Ella, and we moved, like we live in Hamilton. So we rent a house in Hamilton.
Hmm.
We still have our gym in Chatham, Kent, but it's not the best business model by all means, but we're like more of the owner absentee. So we have the 24/7 key card swipe access for members. And it's just right now we make enough to stay open. Like I said, that's all I want is to have the town have somewhere to go. And I'm just home for Christmas holidays. So I'm back training it. And then, yeah, I missed it for sure.
Gotcha. See, that makes sense. What is your kind of training like? I know you said you did powerlifting, but I also you competed as well too, you said, right? So you did like you did some bodybuilding as well too?
Yeah, yeah. So in 2024, so last year, I did my first contest prep season, and that was a lot of fun, man. Yeah, like it. I was there's a couple reasons, and honestly, the primary one was just like we had our daughter Ella, and James wasn't born yet, but just trying to do it all. Like powerlifting is, like I say, I love it very much. I'm certainly not stepping away permanently. It just don't have the time that I can dedicate to the training at least as much as I'd like to. So with that said, I still competed in a meet in 2024. So I had a 4 year kind of layoff between with COVID and my masters and everything. But I did step on the platform in 2024 as a way to get my body back down or down for a bodybuilding contest prep. So I did both. And so the primary reason was like I said, the time constraints, but my passion and love for physiology. I knew that bodybuilding was a quote unquote extreme endeavor, and I wanted to see how far I could push things and take it. And it honestly it was just something novel and new for me to get better at and practice. And that was something that I wanted. Is powerlifting was a grind to add kilos to my total. And yeah, there's so much that I learned, a different style of training, a lot of attention to detail with posing and practicing that, and all the other things behind the scenes that go into it. And yeah, I loved it, man. And now I'm currently training like a bodybuilder, gearing up for prep, hopefully 2027. So the goal is to finish the PhD and get into a prep after that.
Nice, man. So you got the itch. You did it once. You wanted to test it out, and you're doing it again. So it sounds like you did pretty well, and you want to continue to pursue that a little bit more.
Yeah, it was awesome, man. It was again something just I certainly did a lot better than I expected. Yeah, like I dieted down to compete in a powerlifting meet in April of 2024. And I competed as a 75 kilo lifter with a 24-hour weigh-in and did quite well there. I can't remember. I think I totaled 660 kilos and then went right into a contest prep. And to my surprise, and my coaches. So I work with Brian Miner from 3DMJ. I've been working with him since 2020. He's a fantastic guy. But and same thing, like he does both, right? Or has done both, competed high level bodybuilding and powerlifting. So I thought he's a hockey guy as well. So
Yeah, he
I
is.
thought he was the perfect fit. And yeah, we were like, holy shit, you're actually bigger than we thought. And so we were really close to my stage weight. And yeah, so we did that. I won the overall at my very first show. And yeah, I was hooked. I was like, holy shit, really? I might actually be okay at this. Won my second show, my weight class. I lost the overall to a guy named Dan Cole from, like, he runs the Natty News Daily account, or is one of the guys alongside James and Leroy. And yeah, he's just a fantastic guy. But yeah, being that close to like a WNBF national pro card was like, oh man, okay. If he wasn't here, maybe I would have got it, kind of thing. And I know that's not, you don't control who shows up. Same thing. I got second at a show in Calgary to the pro card winner. Then I got to go to WNBF Worlds as an amateur in Boston, and just seeing that level of competition and seeing how peeled these guys can get naturally. It's just, yeah, it's like I want to take it like I said, it was a great learning experience. And now that I know what it takes to get there, I'm like, okay, I can get there and I can push past it. So I'm excited to continue to make improvements and see what we can do in 2027.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Well, so when did you end the competition season? Was that like in the fall of 2024 then at that point? But
Yeah. So truthfully, like we weren't, I wasn't planning on going to Worlds. What happened was, so like my show was, we were going to plan the season from August and then end in October at the WNBF Calgary show, because I work as a powerlifting coach for Calgary Barbell. Shout out to Bryce, Taylor, Danny, Dylan, a group of people. But yeah, I was going to end there. So I flew to Calgary. Boss, Bryce and Dylan flew me out there, and we did some like content and filming and stuff, which was awesome. But it was also like, oh, I'm here to do a show. And that was like, we were just going to wrap it up there. But I was chatting with my wife, and we had the invitation to Worlds, and she was super supportive. Was like, who knows what's going to happen if we backtrack this? My wife is like 7.5 months pregnant at the time.
wow.
We're going to have a second child. Who knows what the world's going to bring? You're here now. You might as well just see it through. Yeah, she's incredible. And yeah, definitely not a one-man show, that's for sure. And so she was really like, when she said that, I was like, all right, that's all I need to hear. Let's go. So extended the season, went to Boston, and yeah, man, I have no regrets. That was the best experience I could have asked for. I got to compete with some incredible athletes, meet some incredibly awesome, amazing people, and people I've looked up to for a long time, like Jeff Alberts, Alberto Nunez, Steve Hall from Revive Stronger. I got to see Babacar in person. It was just incredible, man. Yeah. So then we had our son in January. We ended the season November 2024, son born January 22nd, 2025. And now he's 10 and a half months. And it's a hectic life right now.
I was going to bring that up, man, because we had our first child that last September, so 2024, and I was going to ask you,
Oh, awesome.
I was going to ask you, how did you manage that as a dad? Because I know getting that lean like that, like I've done one fat loss phase since my son was born, and it's definitely a different animal for sure. So I'm just curious, was there anything specific that helped you out?
Yeah. So I will say this. So I'll answer that in twofold. So Worlds for WMBF got announced that it's going to come to Calgary next November. And I was very close to, my wife was extremely supportive. She's like, if you think you can do it, I'd support it. Like, you were totally fine. Chatted with Brian, and you know what? And then I had a meeting with Stu about my timeline, and I'm like, that's just too much, man. My son he's at that age right now, like 10 months, right? He's 11 or 10 and a half, 11 months. Like, he's putting everything in his mouth. He's very busy. He's on the ground. And so that stage, I don't think the juice is worth the squeeze. I want to be present and have that time with him. And like, you don't get that time back. And I want to look back and remember those moments with him. And of course, my daughter too, of course. I think what helped for the first prep with Ella was, first off, it was just her had her and my wife. So my wife and I, we outnumbered her. Right now, we don't outnumber them, but she was a little bit older, and there was so much that we could do. And so without telling her directly, like, she was a part of the prep, right? So we would go for walks every day. We would go to the park every day. We would go to, there's 3 or 4 parks in Hamilton that are near our house, but far enough that it's like, hey, pick which one you want to go to, right? So then she's walking with me. So we're getting steps in. I'm active, playing on the playground equipment with her, chasing her around. We're playing in the yard. I got to be very present as a father. I actually think prep was enhanced, and my role as a father was enhanced because I was in like actively pursuing this activity, as opposed to, I'm so tired, like I would just want to sink to the couch. But she doesn't care, right? Like, she wants her dad. And so it worked out really well. That's my accountability. There was no day, like, after a long day in the lab, getting up super early for a body composition visit or a post visit or whatever, or analyzing muscle, etc. It doesn't matter. Like, she wants her dad. And I think that was a reminder, like, it was a choice I got to make. And again, so I think next year, hopefully all goes well, we graduate, defend the PhD, and then my son will be almost 2, and that's around the same age Ella was. And so and she'll be starting school. So in my head anyway, I have this grand scheme that it's going to work out. But I think, like you mentioned, you've had a fat loss phase, and it is challenging for sure. And yeah, it certainly depends on the context and the situation.
Yeah, for sure. And to me, I think that at least what I've noticed is the sleep side of things. It's really like you have to be super freaking intentional with that. Did you have any issues with that, or was that pretty like smooth on your end there?
So yeah, that was certainly challenging. I won't sugarcoat. I will say, again, my wife, Erica, she's a superhero. Like, she would get up with the kids. So Ellis sleeps a lot better now. She took a long time to sleep through the night. But for the most part, what would happen is I would, like, read her stories. We'll go to bed. I basically would, and I still fall asleep in her bed with her. And then I go to my bed with my wife after she falls asleep. A lot of times I just crash out next to her, wake up in the middle of the night hungry or have to pee because I've been drinking water or whatever all day. But a lot of times what would happen is my wife would come into the room and wake me up and be like, do you have to go walk? And I'd be like, fuck. Sorry, I don't know if you lost swearing, but I'd be like, yeah, I got to go walk. Like, I'd look at my watch or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I got to go for another 10,000, or not 10,000, but 7,500, 8,000 steps. So I was walking anywhere from, Brian had me about 12,000 a day, anywhere from that. But something in me was like, I got to do a little bit extra, 12 to 15. So near the end, I was pushing upwards of that end. But yeah, there'd be days it'd be pouring rain, and I'm like, what am I doing? And then it's this or you get on stage wishing you did.
Yep. Yeah. That's yeah. You have that time component to it, which I definitely think probably helps you work through those tough times like that. Whereas maybe if you didn't have
For
that
sure.
external goal, it'd be a little bit harder.
Yeah, yeah. Right now, again, like my wife is incredible. She mostly gets up with our son because I am up early in the lab. But like last night, like I was up this morning at 4 a.m. and not because I'm this like badass, oh, you gotta want it. It's just literally I love to train, and that's the time I get where it's uninterrupted. There's my
Yep.
phone's not ringing, I'm not answering emails from people, etc. And if I don't get up, and so that happens a lot. Like I'm no Superman, but I often regret not getting up because that's usually the workouts don't get fit in. And that's the biggest struggle, I think. And that has been since we had our son is like a lot of days. Yeah, I've been down to 3 times training. So if I miss a session, now I'm down to 2 and we make it work. But certainly that the cost of doing business. So I wouldn't trade it for the world. You just have to accept it, train hard when you can. And like I said, yeah, because my son isn't sleeping great right now. Yeah, the thought of doing a prep is maybe we'll
Yeah.
see next year. Hopefully he's sleeping better.
Yep. Yeah, man. No, I get it. You basically have to figure out when you can get it in. You got to make the sacrifices around when to do it. And then, like you said, too, you just have to be a little bit more flexible with, what you do as well, too, right? Which can be challenging. But like you said, that's the trade-off that you need to make with sleep too, man. I don't know if this is something, but it's when your kids don't get good sleep, it's one night of it, really not a big deal. I feel like you can go and still have a good session and you feel fine. But it's once you stack a few, then it really starts to add up and it's subconscious almost in a way, right? You don't really, I don't know, at least this is my experience. You don't feel it a ton, but then like you do train and you look back and you're like, okay, I definitely am like recovering a little bit slower. I just feel a little bit slower in general. It's like under the radar almost a little bit there.
Huh. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Like yeah, one night, not a big deal, but that sleep debt it exponentiates, and yeah, you get into, yeah, and that's the other reason for the powerlifting. Like we had our daughter, and I'm like, man, my performance is just tanking.
Yeah. Yeah. That kind of so you guys Brian told you, hey, you had a little bit more muscle than you thought. At least that's what I got from what you said. Do you think that just comes back to, hey, you've been powerlifting for a while, you built a good amount of muscle doing that, or has your training always been more powerlifting style versus hypertrophy? And you said it's changed a little bit now.
Yeah, certainly a mix of both. I started competing. My first meet was December of 2016, but I was training a mixture of both for a while. My entire undergraduate degree was mostly hypertrophy training focused, a lot of bodybuilding, machine, free weight stuff. Yeah, so it's certainly a mix. Like I would say from 2012, like the end of high school, to 2017 was, or 2016, excuse me, was largely a mixture of both. I would train heavy in the off season, winter sort of thing, and then I would do like more strengthening, conditioning, circuit esque style training with my friend's dad for hockey. And yeah, just like I said, I love it all, man. I did a summer internship at a CrossFit gym. I interned for a credit at a gym in Windsor. So shout out to Andrew Hedges and Empire Muscle. That was a fantastic opportunity to intern work at a gym, train clients while getting an undergrad credit for it. So that was awesome. That was more powerlifting focused. And yeah, man, I love it all.
Yeah. I guess then maybe a better question would be, how is training a little bit different now that you're maybe a little bit more focused on, because it sounds like your priorities have shifted a little bit more to bodybuilding. So like how is your training different from when you were more powerlifting focused to now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it shifted in the way of making do with what we have. Before I got into data collection for my study, my second training study, which I'm happy to talk about as well. But before I got into data collection there, I was training. McMaster's University gym is absolutely incredible. Like it is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of the guys that train at like Pure Muscle here in Burlington, Canada. It's quite a famous bodybuilding gym, but they outfitted the gym here, and it's got some of the best like Atlantis machines,
Nice.
it's some really nice stuff. So like the hack squat, pendulum squat, all the machines, pinata, like lat back machines. It's awesome. That has been leveraged a lot in my like off season, but it's worked out in a way. So during the school year, from like September to April, this place is a zoo and it's very hectic. And unfortunately for me, it doesn't open until 6 a.m., which is just
Mm.
an hour or so too late for me because I like to get up, go to the gym, and be home by the time my daughter and son wake up to help out with the kids if I'm not in data collection. So I've been training in our lab. our lab has this is where I do our training studies. So we have a lot of machines, leg press, squat rack. So I do a lot of that. I'm back squatting, barbell bench pressing because we don't have heavy enough dumbbells, which may seem like a flex, but that's just the reality. So we make do with the barbells. And then we have some hammer strength machines. And so I make do with that. With like when the focus, and I have access to the gym here, like the Pulse it's called, and we'll leverage more machines. And that's what I did in prep. Like once I got so lean that I was frail, if you will, we took squatting out and got switched to a hack squat or a leg press, and then dumbbells, machine presses, back work, and stuff like that. Still did some RDLing for hip hinging because I guess that's a whole other story. I had a herniated disc so right after like my daughter was like 10 months old. So that was also while I was in my first year of my PhD. It was awful. Worst thing I've ever been through. Wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. So that was also the reason for the powerlifting while cutting, because I was getting all those neural gains and adaptations back at the same time as cutting. So otherwise, your strength plummets. But anyways, yeah. So following that, I kind of lost the train there. The following that, when we got into the lean state, we just leverage machines and stuff like that. And like I said, I still did some RDLing because it just feels good on my hamstrings and loads my musculature without hurting me. So that was always kept in and helps keep strength levels high.
Yeah, so it sounds like you just leverage machines a little bit more when you have access to them and everything like that. It sounds like, though, still keeping in, again, based on equipment availability, still keeping in like back squats and barbell, like bench press and stuff like that, just because you have access to that. Rep is do you still try and hit like a top set to maintain strength, or you spend a little bit more time in the quote unquote hypertrophy range, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. He'll call like a dynamic double progression. So we'll track performance and repetition and reps in reserve, and then obviously with load, and then try to match those performances from a week to week approach. And that takes a substantially long time, like much longer than people think, right? Let's say like hack squats, for instance. Okay, let's hit this at a 4 to 6 rep range. Or let's say we hit something and get 4. So then the subsequent sets, we're probably going to have to load drop because we're not going to match 4 at the same repetition in reserve. And so then I'll drop load, but then the next week it might be, okay, let's try to get that 5 on the first and see if we can get another set with 4, etc. And then basically once if you're able to go 6 for all 3 or 4 sets or whatever at the same rep in reserve, it's okay, now we're good to add load. And then, we'll modulate the repetition scheme accordingly. So after 4 to 6 for a block, it might be, okay, we're getting leaner now. We want to reduce load, but drive that stimulus. So let's get up to 5 to 8. So it's still heavy, still hard. You're maintaining strength, and performance is like a proxy for maintaining tissue. But yeah, the goal certainly isn't to hit huge PRs and build with the cut. It was more just let's mitigate any losses as much as we can and hold our ground.
Yeah. No, that's awesome, man. Cool. I'd love to dive into research and obviously discuss that paper here too. But I guess first, my question is, in terms of your PhD, what are you like studying specifically for that?
So I'm particularly interested in female muscle physiology. So my PhD is essentially looking at the internal and external variables associated with muscle hypertrophy and strength. And for more detail, like the internal variables that I'm particularly interested is the chronic rise in reproductive hormones, so estrogen, in modulating hypertrophy and those effects. And the external factor is load. So my second study right now is that we're looking at the effects of higher versus lower load with females, as that work's been done in males previously from our lab, but without calling out I don't even want to say researcher, but the influencer now. There's like a famous saying, you might have heard it, that women aren't small men, which is true, but they are still human. And extrapolating very aggressive animal rodent models to human females as opposed to the male research that's been done, I think is probably not correct. But with that in mind, okay, we'll do that work on females. So I wanted to get at the forefront of that, and obviously having a wife and a daughter to hopefully look one day and be like, oh, my dad was a part of that. So I know that's more philosophical stuff, but that's truly the rationale behind it.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So with that's going to be like your dissertation then, right? This is the second study that you're talking about. That will be, and you said that's going to be done in what, the next couple months you said, or next year, or
Yeah, this will be the largest female exclusive study, training study that also quote unquote breaks the skin, if you will. So we take muscle biopsies in our lab. And yeah, like I said, training study for 10 weeks, and we have 52 females going through that. The cool thing about this project as well, Jeff, is that we're recruiting both trained and untrained females, which is the impetus for that is just, it's quite stark in the literature when you actually look at the response, but when looking at untrained versus trained, recreationally trained folks. And so I also wanted to get at that and see if that influences adaptations as well. But yeah, so that we have 38 out of 52 or 37, I can't remember now. We have 15. Yeah, that's right. We have 15 left to finish. So they're going to start up in January, which again, for a training study, 15 is still a lot to go. So we're almost there. We're over three quarters away there. I'm excited to look at that and share those data when they come.
yeah, what are you hoping to find from this study specifically?
Yeah, so there's a couple things, particularly with males, we don't see an effect of neither hormones nor load on adaptations like muscle growth and strength. And the reason is at the end of the day, and we talked about this in the review, but hypertrophy is fibers specific at the cellular level receiving a mechanical overload stimulus, right? So that tension, we lift weights, we signal, we get that tension, gets somehow chemically transduced to promote anabolism or growth in muscle. And that's not really driven by hormones. And when we push to volitional failure or task failure at the fiber level, load is not causative of that. And so the high loads recruit your higher threshold motor units, your type 2 muscle fibers that are used for powerful, explosive movements that fatigue very fast. With lower loads, we have not as much recruitment early on because they're not needed to overcome the external load demands, right? Because the load is lighter. As we contract and get closer to failure, you essentially have motor unit recycling. They're able to regenerate and produce force to overcome the task. But as we get closer and generate fatigue, that's where we get in and start tapping into those type 2 motor units, those higher threshold motor units. And that's why we see equivalent hypertrophy and no difference between the higher and lower loads. The impetus for the study on females is because we don't have those data. And that's first thing, right? So 1 in 5 females lift weights, and those numbers are self-report. So it's probably more like 1 in 10. And so I think that's the nut we have to crack here. We got to get people lifting weights and show equal representation in the literature. And so that is first and foremost. One of the barriers to resistance training that females often cite, and I see this or used to see it as what like owning my gym, is the fear of lifting heavy. Females don't want to lift heavy. They don't risk of injury. And that's not all, right? Just in general, that's one of the barriers often cited. The whole quote unquote look bulky, things like that. And this happens with males too. This is a commonly cited barrier. It's just hard. And I don't want to do that. It's too hard, right? And so that's part of the utility for the lower loads, is that on average, women have less total muscle mass than males. And so what happens when you contract, right, we have less occlusion overall at the musculature. So that means not as much restriction of blood and metabolites building up. At the same token, females also seem to have more capillary density than males, and that also a rationale for fatigability. So they are able to clear out metabolites and that discomfort from lower loads, and also perfuse the muscle with oxygenated blood. So it gives some potential utility for females to tolerate the discomfort from lower loads when you're pushing to failure. So all that to say is, hey, you don't have to lift heavy. If you're afraid of being injured, there's some utility in lower loads. At least that's what we're hoping to show. And when you push close to failure, they both can have some discomfort. There's obviously some caveats with low load training that we can talk about, but it's another option, and at least opens the door to show females, hopefully show females that there's a lot of strategies. And again, like I said, you adapt similarly to the way a male would. And so that's another reason why I'm not a fan of like sex specific programs and more focus on individualizing based on an individual's goals and preferences.
Yeah, that's awesome. So it sounds like the main kind of focus of the study, because you did also mention, I think, estrogen in there, but it sounds like the main focus is the kind of high load versus low load. And then is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're having like tracking and self-reported menstrual cycle tracking. We're tracking ovulation. We reported contraceptive use for this study, but essentially it's a follow-up from our first study. So this study right now, my colleague Grace Lamont and I are doing this one together, and it's a lot of work. And Molly as well has been helping look at psychological stuff, which I think is going to be really insightful as well. But the previous study my colleague Alicia D'Souza and I did was the 3 menstrual cycles of training, leveraging higher volumes, or basically like what we call cycle syncing or menstrual cycle phase-based training. And so what we did was we leveraged folks to train with higher volumes in the follicular phase versus the luteal phase. We also had a non-exercise control condition. So this was a unilateral model, meaning we treated each participant's leg as its own condition because hypertrophy is specific to the limb being trained, which we can get into as well. But we also had a luteal phase condition. And so basically we had participants train with higher volumes in the luteal phase and lower volumes in the follicular phase. And the part of that impetus was that some folks have spelt that the luteal phase, because it's higher in progesterone, is somehow anti-estrogenic or even catabolic has been proposed, which is just not the case. And our work showed this. The luteal phase is not catabolic. You can certainly build muscle in the luteal phase. So all that to say, no difference. Exercise is such a potent stimulus that the chronic rise in reproductive hormones do not influence your adaptations. Now, from an applied aspect as a coach, that's not to say if your symptoms are really bad and you need to take a day. Like, I'm a male with a beard. I'm not, who am I to tell you that you got to go in and train? Yeah. But the same token, I work with national level athletes on powerlifting. They have menstrual cycles. They deal with cramps and bloating and discomfort. That sometimes they have to make weight. We don't get to pick when they compete and when the cycle happens. So there's a lot of considerations from that aspect. But what I will say is, that's coaching 101 and auto-regulation. That's not a new term. This isn't novel. But what is important to acknowledge is this: we want to empower women to train consistently and show up and do the work and get the results. But when you constrain yourself to training only half a month, essentially, right, depending on if you need a luteal phase can last anywhere from around 10 days on average, right? So we've just wasted essentially half the year, calendar year, quote unquote, taking it easier, detrain, because somebody essentially has a program to show you how to create the problem, sell the solution. And that's just not what the literature shows.
Yeah, no, I love that. So again, really what you found there from a hormone perspective is obviously the change in progesterone and estrogen and stuff that's not going to impact muscle growth, right? It's going to be that stimulus that you're placing on the muscle that's going to be the main thing. And then obviously at the end of the day, though, you do want to pay attention to the person's how they respond during that time and make the necessary adjustments if you need to, but don't go into it, hey, we're going to dial back in this for these 2 weeks, because then you get to that point to where you said it's like now you have half the year where you're not training hard and you're not going to see the results then at that point because you're not training as often as hard as you could there.
Yeah, exactly. And like we were chatting with, you have a night or 2 nights of poor sleep. Us males, yeah, take it easy a day, right? That can happen with males, females. Like, again, auto-regulating is such an effective strategy. And to the same token, like, tracking performance is super important, because I have colleagues, one person in particular, like, she gets terrible, like, low back pain in the luteal phase, and she hates it. And yet but I am strong as hell, and my performance is better in this phase. Don't know why, don't know how to explain it. I feel awful, but man, am I strong. And again, that's an individual N equals 1 anecdote. And that's why it's important to track performance, because sometimes, and we see this males, females, and I say this as a gym owner, sometimes the heaviest weight is the front door. You get in there and you'd be surprised what you can get done. And I've had some of the best workouts of my life when I feel absolutely dreadful. And some days I feel really good. And then all of a sudden you unrack the weight and you go, oh, that's heavy today. It's certainly multifaceted.
For sure. No, that's definitely been more true for me lately, where it's, man, I'm like dragging going into it, and then you think it's going to be a terrible session, and it ends up being good. And then it's also happened the other way, same thing as you, where it's you feel like you're going to have a great session, and it's just not great for whatever reason. That's again, like you said, auto regulation is super key. Cool. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense because I know one of the paper that you recently had come out, it was a literature review on load-induced human skeletal muscle hypertrophy mechanisms, myths, and misconceptions. I know you hit on the hormones in there, but this is a fairly new paper, and I feel like it's been pretty popular on social media with the last couple weeks and everything like that. I'm just wanted to bring you on to chat about this. You are the lead author on the paper, right? On this one?
Yeah. Myself and colleagues, Dr. Matt Lees, Brandon Wilson, Jeff Nipper, and Stu were on that one.
Cool. So I guess a good way to start this, what brought this up and what were you looking for out of this paper?
Yeah, so this actually started a conversation with Stu and myself, and that's also the impetus for interviewing or inviting Jeff to come onto the paper. Last year, 2023, we did a case study with Jeff and his brother, following them doing the same training program and things over the course of a year. But in short, he was in the lab for some of the body composition visits were pretty long. So there's some time waiting around, like while his brother's getting ultrasound and stuff like that. So we had some pretty good discussions in the lab. And ultimately, we were talking about a lot of the myths that we see in practice from both in the literature, social media, etc. And Stu is quite prolific on social media as well. And my colleague Alicia D'Souza and I, we wrote a review on the hormones, hypertrophy, and hype, and the evidence-based primer of endocrine influences, et cetera. But the idea was to set up for, okay, there's no really high quality menstrual cycle phase-based study. Let's do it. So that was, if we're going to talk the talk, we got to walk the walk. So while we were finishing up that, we got into some of the more nuances, discussions with some of the myths that still persist out there. So the hormone hypothesis has been one that it's basically what's old is new again, but now that it's not males, it's females. And that was one. And of course, talk about the metabolic stress phenomenon. And again, that started, and again, this is how science evolves. Like it started with Dr. Schoenfeld's like 2010 mechanisms of hypertrophy and the application to resistance training. It's a fantastic paper, right? One of the best, my favorite papers of all time, but it sparks the discussion, and that's how research evolves. And anyways, we've since kind of science has really interrogated that, and we haven't really found in vivo support of that metabolic stress. And really it comes down to tension and that, and of course, so that coincides with the pump and some folks who use the pump as a model for hypertrophy and assessing whether or not exercises are good and in their exercise selection, etc. I'm like, I love the pump, but I don't see the physiological rationale for why that would be indicative of greater hypertrophy. It's just a byproduct. And essentially that was how the paper kind of started, was like Jeff and I were really talking. It's like, you sure it's like just the tension? And so we had a really good back and forth. And then of course, in his book, he's also got a good section about the upper limit of muscle growth. So we also wrote about that in our paper based off our sense of the literature. We wrote that up. And then of course, the other myth that is, I suppose, misconception might be the better word for that one, is the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and how that's a meaningful contributor to hypertrophy. And so that was something that I think was important to acknowledge, that that's a very small, if anything, in terms of contributing to hypertrophy, particularly as the Hornberger labs. So Troy Hornberger is like legendary physiological researcher out of Wisconsin, and they do some incredible work in mechanisms and stuff with rodents and humans. And they developed like a model, this FMD model, to assess growth, and it's the best model we have to date to suggest that the radial growth in cross-sectional area and hypertrophy is due to increases in myofibrils. So the actual, if you think about, if we take muscle and cross-section and order this long spaghetti tube, and within that you have the myofibrils that compose the sarcomeres and the contractile units, and so essentially myofibrogenesis. So you see an increase in actual number of myofibrils within a myofiber, if that makes sense. So the myofibers expand, and that's what leads to the CSA increases. But we don't see a growth of myofibers or like a splitting or hyperplasia. We see this myofibrogenesis. And again, within the, like, it's largely those contractile units. And so the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is this disproportionate growth or increase of the fluid and the non-contractile units. But that, again, it's largely 80% or greater is largely the contractile proteins.
Yeah, I love that. So basically, it was like, hey, you guys were just having conversation as researchers do, and it's like you said, Brad Schoenfeld had that paper back. I think you said 2013. Again, it was like, hey, what actually causes muscle growth? And it was like, obviously tension, damage, metabolic stress, and so that was
Yeah,
the
exactly.
that was the thought process for a while. And it sounds like for you guys, it was, you wanted to review the literature, so the existing evidence out there of what actually does cause muscle growth, right? And what are some myths and maybe some misconceptions that people had. So you obviously I'm assuming you just looked over all the current literature and everything like that on these topics, right? Is that
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things I'll say, a narrative review, it's lower or one of the lowest forms of evidence in the hierarchy of evidence. If you think of, you have your systematic review and meta-analyses, and you have your randomized control trials, right? Cohort study, case reports, expert opinion, anecdote, etc. I would argue that is more of an expert opinion piece. Let's went through peer review. We had some pretty strong reviewers through that process, which I think improved the quality of the paper. But there was no like systematic search of literature. This is just, we've been, particularly with Stu, like we've just been involved with this for so long that we come across these topics again and again. And again, this was like, I was at first, I was like almost scared to like offend Dr. Schoenfeld because he was my master supervisor and I still chat with him all the time. He's an incredible scientist. But I think if anything, I think he'll appreciate the work because he is a true scientist and changes his opinion in the face of emerging evidence. And again, he's updated his take on that paper. So he has a great paper that he wrote with the researcher out of Germany, Henning Walkeraj. And it's like it stimuli load. I can't remember the exact name, but he updated it in 2017. And he always tells people, don't cite my 2010 paper. That paper is important as well, and that's called Stimuli and Sensors that Initiate Skeletal Muscle Hypertrophy Following Resistance Exercise. And that one was pubbed in like 2019. We have that paper, and then I think Mike Roberts has written basically the definitive paper on mechanical overload and mechanisms beyond the mechanical tension piece. So you have things like satellite cell activation, ribosome biogenesis, epigenetics, things like that are also in play. Our focus was more to highlight the primary mechanisms that we're pretty comfortable with, but acknowledge that there's still a lot to understand there. And then really just get at some of the things that, in the grand scheme of things, don't really matter for hypertrophy, and we shouldn't constrain ourselves into those factors. And we acknowledge that the primary driver is mechanical tension and the conversion of that tension into those processes that signal mTOR and other anabolic signaling to lead to this cascade of signaling for muscle growth. But things like hormones, the pump, just metabolite, metabolic stress, all that stuff, it doesn't really factor in. And so the important thing is like adherence, training hard, do it again and again. And I think that's the thing we're getting at. It isn't meant to deter people when we say that. Just because the pump is not promoting hypertrophy doesn't mean that I'm like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If that allows you to adhere to your program, you love getting a pump. Like I do too, man. Hand on heart, I love the pump. I love using BFR training. I use it in our lab where I'm limited with the work I have because my joints are beat up from being a power lifter. I love BFR. There's so much utility for it, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get greater growth from that. And so that's the part I think is really important to acknowledge, like that. And then of course, this stuff is a slow process, man. So just got to do it again and again for months and years, not days and weeks. And I think that was probably my favorite thing to write in that whole paper was like, we got to start viewing things in the lens of months and years.
Yeah, no, I love that. So it sounds like really it's the paper is obviously going to drive people to be able to program better for themselves or for clients, right? Hey, you're programming this way, but let's be out like that may not really be building as much muscle as you think, right? So it's obviously going to inform people that way. But I'm assuming too, this is also this the way you guys set this paper up too is also going to help people with future research as well too, and set the wheels in motion on those side of things as well too.
Yeah, for sure. And certainly there's a lot more to uncover. So we're really scratching the surface with understanding that process of mechanotransduction. So basically that chemical or biochemical conversion of the tension that is experienced at the muscle fiber. There's a lot to unpack between that tension to translation process that remains interesting. Like, again, Hornberger lab just found some longitudinal growth, so sarcomeres in series. So, what we talk about largely the response for hypertrophy in humans is this radial growth, right? So the cross sectional gets bigger, but we can actually start stack sarcomeres in series so they get longer, and that also leads to an increase in muscle mass. They found that independent of mTOR signaling, so that's exciting. That's fairly novel and new, and some other labs have found that nexus as well, so that mTOR may not be the only thing driving or holding the key, if you will. So there's a lot to explore from that front. Just to add to that, I think it's important, like the moving the field forward is certainly important for me and why I went back to graduate school. And so that those are things like, again, the Hornberger lab having that breakthrough with their FMID model. That is a perfect example of how, if we just accepted the Roberts work that interrogated sarco hypertrophy at forefront, then we wouldn't see these myofibrogenesis, if not challenger. And that in of itself, I think the work from the Roberts lab is a fantastic piece of literature that they interrogated, and Cody Hahn was at the forefront of that. And that's incredible science. It just doesn't hold, at least hasn't been replicated. And I think that's important to acknowledge that. Then, yeah, part of the work our lab has done with Stu's oversight, of course, is quite notorious for challenging dogma. So we talk about the load, and our lab has done that with work from guys like Nick Bird and Rob Morton and Sarah Oikawa that have done these studies looking at lower versus higher loads. Cameron Mitchell as well. I should shout out him. He's got a great paper on that. But that's dogma, right? If we just accepted that you had to lift heavy to put on muscle tissue, then that would be false. And so that's why it's important that we challenge things and continue to move the field forward.
Yeah, no, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but one thing I did want to acknowledge with that too is it is tough when we say to discern things like the pump and metabolic stress from mechanical tension, because it's a byproduct. And I think that's the important thing I'm trying to at least get at is just because, so some people will make it seem like it's a strong man saying just because we don't have evidence for it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I think the onus is on those making the claims to show us an independent role. And yeah, it's very difficult to discern that. But again, that's how science doesn't care how we feel. We care about having data and physiological rationale. And essentially, consequently, there's really no need to hypothesize a role for metabolic stress, in my opinion, because those original effects that it was originally hypothesized can be just explained by the result of the mechanical loading and the effects of fatigue. So that's where I'm at. But if somebody's able to design a method to independently look at those in vivo, I'm certainly open to changing my tune. I think, yeah, there's a lot we can continue to learn. Again, as it stands, there's two factors I think that really I hold a strong stance against metabolic stress is like, if metabolic stress were to promote growth, and like environments where we don't have a high degree of tension, like a 1500-meter runner, for example, why are they not jacked, right? They have a ton of metabolic stress, not a lot of tension. In addition to that, where we take BFR and add that to a traditional high load stimulus, if the metabolites from BFR training were an additive effect, then we should see greater hypertrophy, but we don't. So I think that's enough in of itself to suggest right there it comes down to tension at the fiber level, experiencing fatigue.
Yeah, no. So basically, again, with comes to all it, so mechanical tension is the main driver, right? I think maybe what would be helpful for the audience is, okay, the pump, you're saying it's not bad. It's not like you need to not have it. It's just that's a byproduct of the getting mechanical tension and things like that. What would be the best way to describe it? Like, how do you drive mechanical tension? What are the drivers of that, and what's going to actually lead to that? Is there anything specific that you can do there with that?
Yeah. I think it's important that when we talk about mechanical tension, this is like the force that is experienced at the fiber level, right? So we have these essentially what we call mechanosensors. So there's things like integrins and focal adhesion complexes or kinases and large structural proteins like titin that seem to be responsive to both active and passive tension. So what I mean by that is like the active contraction and the overlap of the myosin actin cross bridge or excitation contraction coupling at the fiber level. So when we contract, we squeeze our muscle, we have shortening, and that's the what's happening when when the fibers get fatigued, they can no longer contract to overcome the external load demands of the task, right? And so to get essentially enough sufficient tension, that's going to be the primary driver. So again, higher and lower load training when matched for effort doesn't really matter. And that's why it comes down to pushing hard, getting close to failure at the musculature itself. And that's going to be the factor, right? So some people will say, some of the pushback I've gotten is things like, if the pump is changing like in your muscle, that can change the tension. And it's no, like the tension is happening at the fiber level, and the pump is a shift of fluid and interstitial fluid in plasma. It's not actually entering your muscle. And that's why it's an acute transient process. And so I can't see a rationale for why that would be stimulating further higher threshold motor units, which is what's driving growth.
What would be an example of you're just pushing for the pump, but you're not necessarily providing enough mechanical tension like to the muscle? Is there a specific example of where that may show up? Is it like, hey, you're not like getting stronger over time, you're just going in and staying far away from failure? Is that kind of where that would show up potentially?
Yeah, a primary example in resistance training would be like using low loads, but staying far away from failure, right? And so with higher loads, you have a substantial higher threshold motor unit recruitment rate away sorry, I just got to plug my laptop in, just to overcome the external demands on the fiber to lift the load, right? So lift the weight. If you use low loads, we mentioned that motor unit recycling already, but if the fibers aren't getting fatigued, then that's an area where you can have byproduct from contraction without the hypertrophic signaling. So if you're doing like a set of 100 reps, right, which I've seen done, right, there's 100 rep explosion. I've done that before. Grab a barbell, try to curl it 100 times. It's awesome. But if I did it for 10 reps, I might start to feel a little bit of a burn. Let's say I start to take short rest and then I continue to do it, but I stay far enough away from failure where there's not a lot of tension being generated. I might get a ton of metabolites. We see that again with the shortened rest literature, right? If we do this to have this rise in metabolites and spike in hormones, but we don't push it close to failure, then we're not going to see growth.
What about the hormones? Like, is that kind of, I think one of the things in the paper I saw was like that, hey, that for a while there was a myth of, hey, you want to do like squats and stuff because it's going to increase your testosterone post workout. Is that kind of what you guys were looking at there specifically around that, and how that really doesn't matter when it comes to muscle growth?
Yeah. So that is awesome that you mentioned that, because I personally used to do that. Like I squatted every day for 300 days straight, because part of that was somebody told me that, hey, you get this acute huge rise in test and your bench press will go up and you're going to be jacked. And come to find out, my
You get
squat
bigger
went up
arms.
from all squatting, but my arms did not. Unfortunately, not. And that was work that Sarah Wilkinson and Dan West ended up following up on, where they basically, so Sarah employed a unilateral model where they had like young males, I think it was like 10 males trained 3 times a week for 8 weeks. And essentially they had this spike in the systemic hormones. So things like growth hormone, IGF-1, cortisol, test, obviously, free test. And they found that leg that trained obviously went up, but the leg that didn't do any train, so they had a unilateral model where they had a control leg, and it had nothing. So that was just showing we have hypertrophy without any change in systemic hormones. So the other, like showing that hypertrophy, limb specific, muscle fiber specific. And then Dan West took it a step further, where he did that, where participants would perform like bicep training that was following an intense heavy leg workout, because those hormones do spike from training. And basically then they would have the other arm come in on a separate day that didn't have the hormone spike from the leg training. And yeah, no difference between the conditions. And so it's just showing you the elevations, testosterone, growth hormone, insulin growth factor 1, IGF-1 had no really association with that. And then again, that wasn't enough for people. So they did another study with 50, I think it was 56 young men, and like gains in lean body mass and like leg press strength, no correlations. And then that was, oh, it's untrained people. So then Rob Morton and Sarah like, how to take it a step further, they did a training study with trained males, no effect, no association. And so I think that's where it gets into, we're trying to show like within natural physiological ranges, the systemic hormones really don't seem to have any influence in protein turnover, signaling, and hypertrophy in males. And we have some more work, like I said, coming out in females. And my colleague, Dr. Lauren Clencel-Semple, published her dissertation work showing that acutely. We'll be publishing that chronically very soon.
I think the testosterone's an interesting one, right? Like the acute post-workout testosterone, again, debunked. But I think where maybe some people could get tripped up on is, wait, so you're saying that more testosterone, like, it isn't going to help with muscle growth and again, from my understanding, like you said, it's within the physiological ranges. It's not necessarily going to add, that is not going to be the driver, right? It's going to be the mechanical tension. Now, if you're super low, getting to normal levels will probably help with muscle growth. And then again, if you take like a PED or something and you're super high in
Yeah.
testosterone, that may help a little bit, right? But when you're within those ranges, as long as you're within that, it's not going to necessarily add to muscle growth so long as the inputs are there.
Yes, very important distinction there, Jeff, is it within normal ranges, right? So if you are deficient, you are probably not in an environment that is going to be conducive of anabolism. So I think about my own personal anecdote going through contest prep, testosterone plummets, right? But the importance of the sex and reproduction hormones is for exactly that, reproduction. So in females, the sole purpose, or not solely, but the primary purpose for estrogen is for reproduction. And that's why they're called reproductive hormones. They're not meant to stimulate muscle growth. So when you are deficient, yeah, bringing it up to normal ranges, that's going to be important. But that's where that, again, a different conversation. Now, if you're taking exogenous anabolic steroids, yeah, that's a separate mechanism to stimulate muscle hypertrophy. There's things like androgen receptors that are responsible for receiving that and stimulating growth. Hey, sweetie. Sorry, my daughter's home now. But when you have the exogenous anabolic use, yeah, of course you're going to grow, but that's not the same as normal within healthy ranges. And yeah, yeah, there's really, that's an important distinction. So thanks for drawing that out.
Real quick too on that, if you, let's say you were super low from like a testosterone standpoint, it would more so be the fact of, okay, you're low because of some of the things you're doing, like from a lifestyle perspective, or in your case, extreme dieting to get super lean. It's not necessarily to say that you wouldn't be able to build muscle. It's just like all the things are just going to make it harder for it to happen, right? You're probably going to be less motivated. You're not really going to be able to push your training as hard, right? It's going to be harder for you to get that mechanical tension. That's more so what it's going to be like. You could technically still build muscle with super low testosterone. It's just like the environment is not going to be as conducive to that.
Yeah, for sure. Super important to acknowledge that. If testosterone were, there's a couple areas we can point to, and that first off is females, right? Males have 10, 20 fold higher levels of total testosterone, upwards 200-fold a free test. But when we look at the meta-analytical data, Martin Ruffalo has done a great updated meta-analysis from Brandon Roberts and colleagues that look at this on these sex-based differences. And from a relative basis, males and females gain similar amounts of hypertrophy and strength for that matter. And yeah, you go through puberty and the males have more absolute muscle mass, but when you begin, when those processes end and you are in adulthood, you pick up a resistance training program and you are just as equal to a female counterpart achieving the similar relative gains, right? And so that's important. And that's why I don't think testosterone is really driving anything. And to follow up with that, it's also important to acknowledge that females that in muscle, relatively similar amounts of muscle for that matter, as males that have gone through andropause. Yeah, that's important. If you're not doing something, exercise is and resistance training is such a potent stimulus that's going to overcome any hormone declines. Now, of course, there's aging and things that are associated with the decline in muscle mass and sarcopenia, but that again that's a separate discussion in my humble opinion.
Cool. Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. I think it's important there because I think a lot of people do think that, hey, they just need to have their testosterone levels as high as possible. And it's, yeah, I mean, obviously, I think that's more of a quality of life type situation there versus a muscle building thing. So cool. And again, it comes back to, like you said, the mechanical tension. Like you got to provide that and you need to get stronger over time. And so that ultimately is what you guys were trying to get with this as well. So I think my final kind of question on this around this paper is around sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So from my understanding, again, like you said, there's myofibrillar. I can't say it. I can never pronounce it.
I
But
hear you. Myofibrillar.
yeah, that's really what the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, like you said, the fluid on there, and is not a meaningful. That's not necessarily like true muscle growth in a sense, right? Is that kind of what you guys were getting at here in paper and what you found with that?
Yeah, and so I think that's fair to say. Again, I look up to Dr. Mike Roberts and the work that he does in his lab, and I think it's incredible science. So this isn't like a hate piece or anything. In fact, I think it's again another conversation how we move the field forward. And so they had this sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, like a scientific unicorn paper, but they essentially proposed like three scenarios where it could happen. And in our review, we still propose it certainly could. So some of it could be from this like transient kind of consequence of like training induced edema or swelling. So like where they found it in Cody Hahn's training study was like they took trained individuals that were essentially at a ceiling and gave them a substantial amount of training volume that probably led to these fluid shifts, at least acutely. Now that transient mechanism could be being like a scaffolding effect to promote future fiber growth and filling it, if you will. And or it could be an outcome of like myofibrillar protein accretion, again, at a threshold where you have well-trained individuals. There could be some scenarios, again, higher trained individuals where you have perhaps a rapid or robust growth. So things like anabolic steroids, we may see some sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Certainly open to that possibility. We like to see that literature. Or creatine use, right? We know creatine pools water intracellular. Perhaps that's driving this disproportionate expansion of the cell. But in terms of the chronic increase, again, because the myofiber is largely going to be those contractile units and those proteins anyway, it's 80+% is still that. So it's by and large going to be that leading to your most robust hypertrophy.
So could you almost say sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, if it is something that exists, it's something that could go away easily, right? If you were like doing something that's like super high volume and then you drop down to like low volume, it's like that might account for some of maybe why your size is a little bit smaller or something like that, potentially.
Yeah, it's certainly possible for sure. I think the significance of it promoting long-term hypertrophy is mostly speculative at this point. And again, if it's going to facilitate any growth, it's going to be minor to the myofib and that protein accretion. That's where, again, I think we noted in the paper that they could occur synergistically. There's certainly that aspect. It doesn't have to be one or the other, but again, it's going to be largely the myofibrillar accretion.
Cool. I guess then to wrap this up, what would be some like practical takeaways? Like, did this change anything in terms of how you would train, how you would train for your clients, and maybe what are some takeaways somebody could do like from an application standpoint from this?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, again, the practical application part is important to really put this into perspective. And so we also talked about upper and average and lower responses to resistance training over the course of a 5-year period, and just showing that like growth is an asymptotic thing, right? If it wasn't, then we'd all be Superman, right? Unfortunately, that's not the case. There is a genetic ceiling and a physiological cap, if you will, but that wasn't meant to deter people. It was more to show, hey, you're by and large, you're most likely not going to get there. And if you are, great, you're probably in the minority. But it's meant to show people like, hey, most of your gains are going to be robust. It's going to happen within the first 6 months of your training, 6 months to a year, and that's going to be the majority of what we get. After that, it starts to decline, and that's okay. For some, the juice might not be worth the squeeze, but I think again, the most important thing was just acknowledging that 1 in 5 people lift weights. And so we got to get more people out lifting any form. And that's what is important. Lift heavy, lift light. You're going to increase strength. You're going to increase your muscle. And there's just so much value in that. It's again, like That's where I'm getting at. We got to get people lifting, man. There's a plethora of benefits. Even if you were to reach your genetic ceiling, there's just so many things beyond just big weights and big muscles that resistance training provides in terms of like reduction in cancer risk, all cause mortality, things like that. It's just get out, lift weights. If you're really interested and love this stuff and want to maximize your natural potential, like myself, it's still going to be the big rocks, which my boss, Bryce with Calgary Barbell, always says there's no sexy answers. And that's the reality. Show up, train hard with a high degree of effort, get close to failure, make sure you have sufficient volume. You're increasing the progressive overload, and that dynamic double progression is a great way of doing that. So we talked about that, increasing volume, increasing reps, load, etc. over time. And again, just doing it for months and years. And that's the sexy answer that nobody wants to, unfortunately, hear in the age of social media and instant gratification. But that's what it is. Focus on being consistent, showing up and adhering. That's going to be the biggest thing. Getting sufficient volume, doing it a couple times per week, and using frequency as a tool to leverage volume. And then obviously just training hard. And that's going to be, by and large, 95%, if not more, of your benefits, and your gains will come from that.
Did you guys do any volume research or anything? Was that a part of the paper at all in any form or fashion? Like, because I did see that mentioned a couple times. Hey, you want to make sure you do enough volume. So was there anything specific there with that?
Yeah, so we talk a little bit about that. There is a dose response meta analysis that's been done. So Dr. Schoenfeld's got a great 2017 dose response volume paper with James Krieger. Fantastic read. And that's where that like 10 to 20 sets recommendation comes in. And then the guys at Data Driven Strength, so like Josh Pellin, Zach Robinson, and those guys did a meta regression, meta analysis, just updated it essentially. And we see this dose response, like the more work you do, as seems to check out with promoting greater hypertrophy. But again, that still remains to be fully elucidated. There's been some that have scrutinized like the model because like essentially hypertrophy goes up forever. And there does have to be a ceiling. But I think by and large, again, the one of the important things with the research is it doesn't tell us what to do, right? It just provides concepts and starting points. And that's what I think is good if we base our a starting point, if you will, right? Okay, we see this literature somewhere between 10 and 20 sets seems to be a really good range, right? But the difference between 10 and 20 is quite large, right, in practice. So that's why it's important to try things out for yourself, see how you respond. Maybe a little bit more volume can be leveraged. Maybe you can't recover from that volume, or you run into a joint issues with that many sets, et cetera. So you got to find ways to maybe add in frequency and leverage volume that way, or decrease it and get an extra rest day. Yeah, the volume literature is interesting because it does, like I said, it does seem to have the like a dose response effect. So doing more is better, but obviously that is going to be limited as well.
Yeah, the volume literature is super interesting. That was my takeaway too. Is yeah, you probably want you could if you want to really like grow as much muscle as you can and as fat, like you probably want to try and get in as much as you can that keeps the quality high, and that's going to look different for everybody. Like those numbers are going to be a lot different. I'm sure Derrick, when he was 22, no kids, you could probably get away with a lot more volume. Now you got two kids, it's like your volume is probably a lot lower that you can recover from,
Yeah,
and then your intensity that
yeah,
you can
exactly.
train at. It's like there's just so many variables that go into it.
Yeah, it's influenced by a plethora of factors. So we talk about that, but if you think about like your genetics, your prior training volume, right? Like somebody who's well trained like yourself versus a beginner, like that training volume is going to matter. The rest intervals that you employ in your training is going to influence how much volume you can do. The type of measurement techniques that assess hypertrophy, right?
Yeah.
Like ultrasound measuring cross sectional area in studies versus muscle thickness. There's some, even you could argue nutritional aspects, right? That's going to affect your response to hypertrophy. Again, I think yeah, we definitely wrote a section that's acknowledged research is going to help inform individuals about establishing approaching training volumes, but no single study should be used to draw inferences or decisions, right? And we talk about that. We have a figure where a lot of our training studies are short term, they're small samples, and they involve untrained participants. And that's why it's important to take these studies, and as Brad will always say, it's a piece of the puzzle, and it shouldn't be the holy grail, right? It's Just we take the weight of the literature and we pool them and meta-analyze that data, and that's important to do. But to take one study as gospel, when again research tests concepts and we report group averages. And I remember the infamous 52 set
Yeah.
study, and it was like everybody lost their minds, right? Oh my god, there's no way these guys are doing this 52 sets of quads. And there's a few things. It was short term, there's the lab effect, and it's highlighting concepts that it is, maybe there's a specialization cycle, but that isn't to say go rip 52 sets
For
every
everything.
week in your training block. That exactly. And so it's just again highlighting concepts, group averages. There's some utility in high volumes. Maybe if you want to grow your arms, you leverage upwards at, maybe if you do 15 sets, maybe you go up to 20 sets and see how you respond. But maybe as a consequence of that, you have to lower your, due to time constraints or whatever, you have to lower your leg volume. And it's a never ending pursuit. And that's why I love doing this stuff, is you can pull so many levers and adjust your adaptations. But again, those are, I would say, more the fringes, if you will, like maximum majoring in the minors, I guess might be a better way of saying it.
Yeah, cool, man. Well, really appreciate your time. You do a ton of great work, so keep it up. I guess the big thing would be, where can people find you? And do you have anything like coming out on your end that you want to let people know about and that you're excited about, or anything like that?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Jeff. It was really fun to
Yeah,
talk
man.
about this stuff with you, so I appreciate it. Yeah, if you're interested in chatting more, I'm pretty active on Instagram, mostly just like posting photos of like my kids and family and like training and stuff like that. But I'm Derrick underscore CBB, so Derrick DERRICK, and Derrick at CalgaryBarbell.com. If you want to email me, have some deep thoughts about skeletal muscle, I'm happy to share them with you. As always, I think, like, I appreciate you, Jeff, for having me on. I think it's important for us researchers to be out there actively communicating, conveying the translation of do the work we do, and it's important. So thank you for that.
Yeah, man. No, like I said, appreciate all the work you do. I know that this research stuff is not easy and it's very time consuming. So appreciate it. And also, again, appreciate you coming on here and discussing what your findings too. And then obviously, again, you're somebody who applies it in the real world. And again, I think that's rare. Keep up the great work, man. And again, really appreciate your time. And yep, we'll talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, looking forward to it.